Hello, I am Dr. Summer Cherland, and I want to tell you the story of how we came as a country to celebrate the concept of the first Thanksgiving. Did you ever make the Pilgrim hat or the Native American feather headdress for one of those school-wide reenactments of the first Thanksgiving? If you're much younger than me, or even just a little younger than me, you probably didn't. Thankfully, local activists brought an end to this tradition, which was called the Thanksgiving pageant. But if you're my age or older, you probably participated in one of these or more at your local public school. So I only did a Thanksgiving pageant once. I was really little, and it was probably the last year that my school was allowed to do a Thanksgiving pageant, thankfully and gratefully, because activists brought an end to it. My teacher handed me a Pilgrim Girl craft package. But ever the 6-year-old emerging feminist, I refused. I didn't want to wear a bonnet and a dress and serve the boys turkey dinner in the cafeteria the next day. I wanted to wear the top hat with the shoes because those had buckles. So after negotiation, my teacher begrudgingly handed me a Pilgrim Boy craft kit and I went to work. I remember carefully cutting out the paper form of the hat and shoes. I was supposed to color the hat part in with brown or black crayon and the buckle part with yellow or gray. But I wanted my buckle to really, really shine. So I broke the rules. That night, I brought my craft project home with me, and I wasn't supposed to. My big sister helped me outline the inside of the buckle with Elmer's glue, and then we shook gold glitter on top of it. And then we kind of shook out the extra glitter onto folded newspaper, and we gasped at the dazzling beauty of my sparkling Pilgrim Boy hat. That next day at school, as I sat next to other middle class white children, some of whom were dressed as nondescript and culturally appropriated Plains warriors with feather headdresses, I knew my golden glitter buckle was the envy of all the school. Every year around this time, I think about that hat and I think about that gold buckle. True story. I wonder about what the teachers thought they were teaching us. And I think about why the history of Thanksgiving, for all intents and purposes, has been marketed to children. Isn't Thanksgiving actually a fairly complicated holiday? Aren't the violent and traumatic foundations of America a little heavy for kids? And if they're not too heavy, why aren't those aspects incorporated into this story? And shouldn't adults be probing the history of a holiday that we celebrate every single year as a country? What about the recent claims and recent, relatively, of course, that this holiday is actually a celebration of Pilgrim violence against Native Americans? What's the real story of the first Thanksgiving? Here are some facts we know for sure. 1, there was a feast in 1621. Recent English and Dutch colonists joined with the Wampanoag people in the Massachusetts Bay Area to celebrate a successful harvest. It probably took place in July. 2, they did not call it first Thanksgiving. They probably didn't even call it Thanksgiving. And that's because 3, the colonists were Puritans. They were reformative Calvinists who rejected celebrations and holidays. They brought from England with them 3 traditions: the Sabbath, fasting, and Thanksgiving, little t. Thanksgiving followed a day of fasting. It was a day of prayer, of gratitude, and maybe a communal meal. Therefore, the harvest feast of 1621 was never associated with the concept of Thanksgiving until many years later. So here's the story of how a Wampanoag and Puritan harvest feast, which probably occurred in July of 1621, became the first Thanksgiving, big T, as we know it. No original sources from that feast exist from 1621. Instead, a year after the festival, a New England pilgrim mentioned the harvest mentioned the harvest dinner in a booklet, but that booklet wasn't even in wide circulation for at least 200 years until about 1840. Meanwhile, over the years, the Puritans across New England continued to observe the fast and Thanksgiving little t, an organically kind of early winter celebration began to take shape. The celebration was fairly solemn. It was a regional day of prayer. usually with a community or communal meal, and it was widespread through New England, but not the South nor the West. Every year, the US president would declare a day of Thanksgiving, little t, as a national holiday or just a national event. But this day could be any time. It could be in April or February. Really, it wasn't yet the end of November. Not until the Civil War, when President Lincoln and fellow Northerners were looking for ways to unite the country through official holidays. Lincoln proclaimed the last Thursday in November to be an official national day of Thanksgiving and reflection in 1863. But at this point, there was no mention of Pilgrims, Indians, or first Thanksgiving, big T. That comes later. Thanksgiving in 1863 was simply a day to be with your family and loved ones and be grateful. Over the years, presidents continued to declare specific Thursdays, almost always near the end of November, as the official day of family and Thanksgiving. At the same time, Americans are becoming increasingly interested in their own history. They begin to be nostalgic for the colonial and revolutionary generations, and they begin to tell and retell stories of the country's founding. In 1939, Franklin Roosevelt mentioned the people he called the, quote, first Americans in his presidential declaration of Thanksgiving. And you should look that one up because it's the year of two Thanksgivings in some states. During World War II, a patriotic fervor, some of it authentic, some of it forced or coerced, swept through the nation. Americans were clamoring for sound bites and easily remembered stories about the United States, its special history, and its march towards superpower. Enter the first Thanksgiving as we know it. The World War II generation took the New England custom of celebrating an annual winter holiday of Thanksgiving, little t, and they combined it with a now mystical version of that July harvest feast among those first Americans, English colonists and Native Americans. They stirred the two traditions together until they made one pumpkin-sized and pumpkin-shaped story, and they dipped it in autumnal gold, and that's how we arrive here at the appropriated and golden story of a first Thanksgiving that really did happen, but didn't really happen. And that brings us back to the buckle. Why my fascination with this buckle? Well, when I was 6, it was all about the glitter. My fascination stemmed from that shiny gold brass. But now I really do think about that buckle a lot. And though I still love me some shine, it's about so much more than the glitter. You see, the Pilgrims of the early 17th century probably didn't wear buckles like that. And if they did, never that many in one outfit. Most of the contemporary artwork and descriptions we see of 17th century New Englanders don't really include a widespread propensity for buckles, except when it comes to the first Thanksgiving. Where do they come from? Did the Pilgrims just wear these buckles on special occasions? Weren't these the same Pilgrims who rejected anything gauche or flashy? Why at this one dinner did they decide to bust out the brass? The truth is they probably didn't. The buckles were part of a massive branding that took place more than 200 years after that initial July feast. During the Civil War, as America was just beginning to show interest in that story of a first Thanksgiving, artists and teachers began to create illustrations, which helped to translate the tradition of fasting and Thanksgiving little t, along with that description of a harvest feast, into the tale of the big first Thanksgiving. So how do you demonstrate in artwork that these characters from centuries ago were outdated, old-fashioned, and ancient, but also just a little bit magical? The costuming of the Pilgrims and Native people became increasingly ridiculous over the years. Wampanoag people were drawn as caricatures, nondescript, plain Native Americans, Plains Indians, Sioux warriors, usually becoming shorthand for in American history for all Native people, regardless of location or way of life. And the Pilgrims took on their own fantastical image. Think about it. What do Santa Claus, Mother Goose, Halloween witches, and leprechauns all have in common? They're all fantasy creatures, and some are based on historical fact. They're a little bit childlike and a little bit super old, and they all wear buckles. Hence the Pilgrims, hence the buckle. Pilgrims in much of today's illustrations are just like that and just like this. They're portrayed almost as little children. right? And they usually come in pairs, one male, one female. It started with antebellum and Victorian artists who sought to make the holiday and its story attractive to children, with the lesson being that these were the mothers and fathers of the American story. Aren't they old, but also aren't they super cute? So when you're shopping at the grocery store or grabbing a latte in a red holiday cup or dropping off your kids at school this month, chances are you're gonna encounter a pilgrim, and you'll know it in an instant. A paper cutout or tissue centerpiece like this one of a childlike miniature adult wearing bright colors, Dutch boy haircut, jacket, and shiny brass buckles. That buckle, it's a nod to you and to me, because we know that though a harvest festival in 1621 did happen, and it was a relatively peaceful celebration between English colonists and members of the Wampanoag Nation, the Thanksgiving Big T that we celebrate and the story of the first Thanksgiving that gets told every year is much newer. This buckle is a symbol of the fantastical fairy tale that has been spun over the years. The story that started to be spun during the Civil War and progressed during World War II to promote patriotism and a false sense of national heritage. Because just like there really was a man named Saint Nicholas, there really were pilgrims, and there really are Wampanoag people. And they really did feast together. But the buckle is our reminder that their story, true though it may have been, has been reimagined and repackaged into an easily consumable story appropriate for children and retold every year with dreamlike fascination.